Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Bohl. I'm a senior Middle East and North Africa analyst here at the RANE Network, and I am joined today by Rodger Baker, our director of the Stratfor Center here at the RANE Network. And we are doing a checkup on our quarterly forecast, which we published at the beginning of this month, just a few days before President Trump's Liberation Day announcements helped give us our first status check of one of our top forecasts. And we're going to talk today about global tariffs, about Iran, the Russia, Ukraine ceasefire talks, and of course about a little bit about Gaza. So, Rodger, why don't you start us off with what's going on with global tariffs, how it factors into our annual, and what we're now seeing evolve through the quarter?
Yeah, certainly. And I think that's important that you bring it up. The quarterly forecasts are here as both a check-in on the annual, where are we along that longer term trend, and as looking at things that may be more significant in a shorter duration, allows us to see shifts and changes. And of course, the tariffs are perhaps a little bit higher, a little bit more intense than we had anticipated. I think that we put a range, and these fall within that range, but certainly at the upper end of the range of what the likely tariffs could or would be. I think the methodology of the tariffs and their design has certainly been a little different than we anticipated, and it clearly shows a focus on that raw concept of trade deficit, which is very different than trade barriers or things of that sort, and largely difficult to overcome. So now we're seeing over the next couple of months the negotiation moment. And while this administration has in part argued there will be no negotiations, other aspects of the administration have argued there will be negotiations. We do anticipate certain negotiations, certain carve-outs, probably not a change in the overall tariff dynamic, but certainly countries are going to be able to make deals. What those deals are is probably going to be very unique to each country, because again, if the issue is trade balance, it's not clear that some of these countries can buy their way out of that trade imbalance. And secondarily, if, as we're hearing, that President Trump is likely to be involved in each individual country negotiation, then there's a lot of vagaries that may come out of the president himself. And I think one of the things we were looking at, Ryan, also is, yes, this is disruptive to international trade. This is a major shock. Certainly in the near term, it's a huge shock, and we've seen the impacts on markets as well. But I know we've been discussing, maybe not directly in the quarterly, but certainly discussing since the tariffs were announced, there are some countries that may gain a little bit of competitive advantage in this, in that they're being hit less. And maybe for you, throw out Turkey onto the table.
Right, exactly. So Turkey's one of those textile manufacturers that likes to see other textile countries get hit with higher tariffs. So there's that nuance. It's not necessarily disruptive. It's also restructuring and changing the rules of the game. And speaking of negotiations and rules of the game, we would be remiss to not note that the United States and Iran are returning to a form of indirect negotiations. A lot of distrust, especially from the Iranian side, on this process. But the Iranians, the supreme leaders kind of made it clear what the Iranian strategy is going to be for the next 4 years, which is not necessarily a deal, but no war. So as he puts it, no deal, but no war. And the idea is to string out the United States and the Americans for as long as possible to prevent the possibility of military escalation against the Iranians. And I think what's different in our context, we've been cracking this for many years, these Iran talks, ever since President Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. And what's different this time is the Israelis have attacked Iran twice openly. It was not the end of the world. It did not cause the regional conflict we have been concerned about. It caused an escalation, but it stayed within a dynamic that allowed the prime actors to step away from that. And with that experience of the past year, we have a lot of other things that we need to keep in mind in terms of, we have our baseline, which is that talks will lead to talks that lead to talks that don't necessarily lead to breakthroughs within the quarter. But that doesn't mean that there isn't the possibility of rapid escalation. And the United States has deployed its B-2 bombers to Diego Garcia. The Israelis certainly have the capability of striking Iran from a conventional standpoint at any time. The open question is, has Washington lost its patience with the diplomatic process? And I don't think that that's imminent at this point, but we need to continue to look and monitor for that and recheck our assumptions routinely, because The Trump administration right now is heralding in a new definition of the word uncertainty, and I certainly think that applies to the Iranian situation as well.
Well, and I think as we look at this Iran issue, we may want to also consider the president's negotiations with North Korea in the first term. And that was a set of negotiations that started with a heightened sense of imminent conflict, fire and fury, little rocket man, all sorts of both physical dynamics and rhetorical dynamics. In this administration, clearly we're seeing, as you mentioned, the B-2s, we're seeing a redeployment of missile defense systems from the Indo-Pacific into this theater, which is interesting given the idea of the shift to the Pacific. Clearly, there is a demonstration of both capability and willingness by the United States to utilize force. We saw the actions against the Houthis. We see a continued degradation of Iranian proxies in the region. And therefore, the positioning has to be such that, as we see with this administration, they want to show they're willing to go all the way. They're willing to use force. And they're demonstrating that through these deployments, through these actions, through these risks. It doesn't mean they will ultimately follow through, but it does mean that they are putting that extremely strong pressure. And I think one of the things we're going to have to watch is, how do the Iranians interpret the risk tolerance of Trump 2.0, which seems to be acting different than Trump 2.1, in that rather than being isolationist, it's almost the United States being imperialist and apparently being willing to take greater outward risks. There's even rumors that the U.S. is looking to reestablish air operations out of Afghanistan. So this encirclement dynamic, plus the shift potentially in U.S. relations with Russia, may isolate Iran. Is that enough to get the Iranians to feel, rather than that they can just stall, that they actually need to make some concerted efforts? And then the final question is, even if this administration gets into formalized negotiations with Iran, do they, as we saw with the North Koreans in the previous round, simply fall apart because of a vagary of action by one side or the other?
Certainly. And of course, there's always that open question of whether or not the Iranians would give the United States what it really wants, which is a comprehensive shift in the way that they behave within the region, of giving up their missiles, giving up their proxies, abandoning the idea that Iran is its own independent great power outside of the American-led rule system. And if they're not, then perhaps we'll see well beyond the quarter, as you mentioned, a similar repeat with the North Korea experience. Now, with that all said, we have another set of negotiations that are still underway that don't seem to be making a great deal of progress, at least at the moment. But Rodger, why don't you talk us through what's going on in Russia and Ukraine for the quarter and what we're looking for in that dynamic?
Right. And I think it's good to put both Russia, Ukraine, and Iran in the same context. And that is that this administration appears to be trying to wrap up issues along the Western Eurasian periphery, so that it can finally make what the U.S. has been trying to do since Bush 2, the pivot to Asia, the shift to Asia, the focus on China. And it feels it needs to shut down these issues. So looking at what the U.S. is trying to do with Russia and with Ukraine, there was a brief surge where it looked like the United States was going to kind of push some things through. The Ukrainians fell in line. The Russians sort of appeared to be willing to do some sort of ceasefire, or at least partial ceasefire, and then things seem to have fallen into the background. The Ukrainians are now bragging about pushing back into Russian territory. The Russians are continuing to carry out their attacks. But it does seem that there is a quiet back end active push by the United States to drive the Russians to come to some sort of temporary bargain in the next couple of months. We do think that these negotiations will come to some additional levels of ceasefire, not a resolution. And then the big outstanding question is, what of the security force by the Europeans? Where do the Europeans stand in this? The Europeans had felt like they were being left out. Then the Europeans had rallied and were talking all tough about being able to build large forces and going in there, and Russia couldn't stop them because Ukraine was sovereign territory. And now Europe is focused on tariffs and focused on trying to figure out a way to deal with its own potential internal crises and internal challenges, it's not clear that the Europeans have as much attention on the Russia-Ukraine frontier. And for Ukraine, for Kiev, that's probably a net negative in their bargaining position. If the Europeans are less focused on that, and the United States clearly is not terribly focused on any one of these individual issues at any given moment.
And speaking of, one of our last holdovers from the previous administration that the United States is still focusing on is, of course, the Gaza conflict, which at one point was the center of instability for the region and has now been compartmentalized back into the Gaza Strip. And this is one of the areas that our annual forecast and our quarterly forecast were able to align because we never were terribly optimistic about the survival of that ceasefire. We just weren't sure precisely the moment that its second phase would collapse. And that's already taken place now. And what we're looking at now is the United States backing the Israeli position pretty expansively, but without putting a whole lot of American skin into the game, so to speak. There's no attempts to build a pier with U.S. troops, or certainly Trump said that they were going to take over the Gaza Strip. That plan has been quietly abandoned, but they are allowing the Israelis to conduct operations as they see fit. And there's no sign of sanctions or arms holdups to Israel in the course of this new conflict. And it looks like the Israelis are moving into a position of reoccupying the Gaza Strip formally and potentially pushing a fair bit of the population out, probably to a place like the West Bank, before they have their own elections they have to face down next year. But even so, kind of connecting us to our tariff story at the beginning, the Israelis they've been having a warm relationship with President Trump, but they're not getting exemptions from the tariffs. And Trump even cited all the military aid being sent to the Israelis as one of the reasons that maybe it is a fair thing that they've gotten a higher than average tariff rate than some of the other countries that only got 10%. They got 17%. And so we're looking at this quarter in which the easy narratives of certain alliances and certain relationships behaving predictable ways, I think, is being challenged and tested and realigned, and that there are specific strategic goals being carried out, even by an administration like this, which has so much media focus and so focused on kind of winning the news day. There's nevertheless geopolitical imperatives that they are pursuing and that they are realigning towards, and they're showing themselves to be pretty experimental in their approach in doing so.
Yeah, and I think, as we look at this quarter, this is probably the quarter where we'll finally get a better read of this administration on what are there is there a central strategic theme? Are there a bunch of competing themes? Who's starting to win out in the actions? Are tariffs, a tool or a negotiating tactic? All of those questions that have sort of been humming along and half answered here and there. I think that we're going to finally start to see the results coming out within this quarter that will give us a better read of how to think about the next 3.5 years.
Certainly, contrast that with Trump 1, which you and I both went through. It took us a long time to learn what the habits were going to be of that administration. And I think that this administration knows what it wants to do and is implementing it quickly. And it's really up to us analysts to try to parse it together and figure out what the new grand strategy is. But I agree, Rodger. I think they know they have a vision in mind. This is our quarter where we can get some real clarity on it. To see our forecast, please visit our website at the RANE Network. That's RANE network.com. And if you have any more interest in other areas of responsibilities, places like Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Latin America, which is certainly a huge part of the tariff story, we have detailed forecasts. These were just some of our top 4 movers and shakers that we're checking in with every quarter. Rodger, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Ryan.